Hello and welcome to another episode of Mordred's Community EU4 Political Chat, joined by a new co-host this week, the Martian. Martian, welcome to the program.
Hello, glad to be here.
So we'll start off, touch on the great powers as we see them right now. Little bit of change. England, Ruthenia, Spain, 1, 2, and 3. Bachmanis being AI last session and fighting a relatively painful war with Maywar, wasn't able to keep up. Any surprises here on this list for you?
Not really. I'm glad to see that Qing and Japan are starting to work their way up, because I think that's definitely going to provide some better context, later game, some more fun stuff to happen. So it's good to see them developing well.
And we'll dive in, touch base on Europe. Another relatively quiet session in Europe. Um, I don't even think there were any player wars this week. Last week we had Hanover versus Bavaria. Um, I think the most action in Europe came from Tuscany and Hungary against taking down AI Mamluks. You want to walk us through that experience?
Um, it was certainly interesting because you kind of get used to, especially in multiplayer games, fighting AI and kind of just autopiloting your way through that. Um, but with a nation such as the Mamluks, that's a moderately fatal mistake whenever they have 250,000 troops and just as good of quality as every other player in the game, because of the fact that Fizz did do a good job of getting all those modifiers in place before he left. Um, and so in my hubris, I got 30,000 stack wiped. Tuscany suffered a great bit more in the affair, but needless to say, it actually made for some pretty interesting wars, just because of how many troops the Mamluks still have.
And if we take a look at the trade map mode now, um, almost all the trade in Constantinople moving out towards yourself and Pest, Alexandria, the vast majority going towards Venice. Um, how much more land from the Mamluks do you plan on eating?
Um, Me and Jamie, the Tuscany player, have kind of drawn out a land agreement. And so basically, he's going to continue to take lands in Egypt as well as the Jerusalem state and the state directly below it, or the Palestine state, sorry. And then I'm going to continue to take the Aleppo node to just kind of increase my trade power there. Um, Generally speaking, though, I'm going to be slowing down a little bit just in order to keep up with tech and ideas, because obviously it's some pretty costly lands to take here. So.
And tremendous amount of trade value captured in the Persia node. Aleppo, obviously, one path for that. Um, Golden Horde currently being swallowed up by Ruthenia. Any plans to continue moving into Persia and take advantage of some of this rich land that's currently held by Golden Horde and its um, vassals?
Currently, I don't have any desire really to do that. Mostly just because I'm already pretty occupied in the West, and I'm sure I'll be part of several more player wars there. And just from experience, whenever I played Ottomans last, I know that I don't really want to try and make more friends of players that I have to fight at some point. So I've definitely tried to be nice to Dutch, and I'm not touching Persia at all.
Okay, interesting. And when we pivot back to mainland Europe, as we mentioned, relatively quiet session. Ireland flipped to England. Spain continued to expand into Africa. France into Africa, but as well, we'll touch on later. Um,
England is now a theocracy, which is fun.
the dev of Europe is it's impressive. Are we reaching? Is pressure building in your mind? Um, does something have to give? Are we bound for a large scale player war?
It's really kind of interesting because I think pressure was building for a long while, but now that me and Ruthenia both don't have any pressure from the East and having both of those players leave, neither one of us care to have any war at all in Europe because we just don't need to. And so really any conflict left, I think, comes either over the lowlands or between Hanover and Bavaria. And I think that's kind of the big question now is, are we going to see Germany stay like this in a bunch of pieces, or is someone going to make moves to unify it?
And Interesting that you mentioned a bit of a power vacuum here. Um, the one thing we did have this past session was Qing moved relatively aggressively towards Ruthenia. I believe, oh, they still have a little slice of Golden Horde between them, but they're pretty close to a border there. Do you
And
think?
notice the rebels there that are being
Yeah,
let
it's
loose.
Orthodox
So
rebels.
I'm curious to see what Rarely is planning on doing with that, whether it's just using that as the syncretic faith, or
No, no, it's an
um,
intentional choice to convert.
do you think he's gonna fully convert to Orthodox?
I believe so. Yes.
That's very interesting.
Mothballed forts and the zealots are coming.
Hmm.
If Ruthenia, Qing, Japan go to war, is Hungary there, or is that Ruthenia's fight to fight?
It really depends on what Ruthenia wants. Seeing as we've been allied all game, I'd be more than happy to participate in it. But at the same time, I could see Ruthenia asking me not to participate in it exclusively to defend Europe in the event that he gets attacked by either England or Hanover. So
Hmm. Interesting. Do you think the war between East and West is next session, 2 sessions, 3 sessions out?
it's hard to tell. I think Rarely is definitely going to be smart about going into it, and I think with the if he actually does swap Orthodox, I think it's going to be several sessions away, just because of the fact that obviously you need a good session to recover from the swapping. It probably will take a whole session to swap. So I think we're still a good bit away from that, and I think especially it depends on what Dutch does. Now that he's back in the game, I think that's going to change up the region a lot, and it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
Yeah, it's interesting. On paper, Japan almost 400 force limit, Qing almost 400 as well. Um, we got 500 plus from Ruthenia, 400 income versus about 550. So manpower tilts slightly in favor of Ruthenia, but it's almost an even fight. It probably would
Hmm.
be in favor of the Asians, but it would be a pretty good war.
I think in particular, especially with the region you're fighting over, I think it's in the favor of the defender, just because it takes so long to move through those lands, and it's really bad attrition wise to try and actually fight in the region that they'd be fighting over. And not to mention that, if you have Qing fighting Ruthenia, they have to go all the way to Poland, and Ruthenia going to Qing, you have to get all the way into China. So it'd be a really hard war for the attacker, regardless of which side attacks.
That's a Yeah, very good point. And the provinces are also quite large, and that does
Hmm.
impact travel time. So if you scorch a province here, and it's pretty difficult to time your reinforcements fighting in provinces this large in this region. Whereas in
Hmm.
Europe, it's quite a bit easier. And Timurids came back this session, bit of I'd say comeback story. Uh, any chance he can be in a position to impact any of these player wars as we approach the end of the game? Manpower cap still relatively low, eco not super strong, but um, what do you see out of Timurids in the next couple of sessions here?
I think he's in an interesting position that, while not super strong individually, is in a great spot as far as being in the middle of as much action as Dutch wants, or as little action as Dutch wants. If they want to, they can go into Qing. They can try and fight Ruthenia. They could go and beat up the Mamluks some, or if they just want to have some practice rounds versus AI. And especially with that alliance with Baja, I mean, they've got a lot of options on their plate.
And then um, Japan continued its conquest in Southeast Asia, growing a few of its vassals, Pasai, Brunei, Khmer. Um, Still a little bit of conquest there, but in the India War, Japan pieced out white peace with Baja. Baja took down Mewar, which was inevitable just based on the mismatch of the countries going into that war. Had it been AI, yes, Mewar would have been able to piece out, but player versus player, Baja was going to win that 10 out of 10 times. Do you think Japan is looking to keep Baja alive so it's got um, a target to go after a little bit a little closer to home rather than having to march all the way to Poland?
I don't know. I mean, and that's one of the things I think it kind of goes back to Rarely. Obviously, if I think if Rarely asks, I think Japan will go and help against Ruthenia. But Baja is just one of those things that's big, scary India player, and at the end of the day, it takes so long to actually take anything of substance from India that I doubt that Japan would think it worthwhile to bother with. Especially considering the fact that Bahmanis haven't expanded to the Spice Islands at all, and they've kept pretty much in India. I don't think they're going to be at arms too much just because it's really not worth it for either one of them.
Yeah, it's interesting. The manpower is heavily stacked in Japan's favor, but eco-wise, Baja is still quite powerful.
Mm.
We'll pivot now just briefly into the New World. We got New Württemberg, we got Better Mexico, we got South Mexico, we got Portugal. We'll save Portugal for a little bit later, but from the colonial perspective, any surprises so far?
I think it's pretty surprising that South Mexico exists at all. That's definitely one I wasn't expecting. And I think the big question with South Mexico is how long will it last before Portugal comes and just wipes it off the map? And if the longer that Portugal waits, the stronger the possibility is that South Mexico might actually be able to fight back on their own. And with how much of a stalemate there is in Europe right now, I could see it being quite a while. So it can make for a more interesting fight than you naturally assume.
And then one thing to call attention to, New Württemberg approaching 1,000 development, 400k manpower in of its own right, almost 250 from a force limit perspective, and um, still quite a few buildings yet to go. It'll be interesting to see um, plenty of force limit, plenty of manpower to go once it starts developing. The coast is developed, but the inland is not. Do you think that may tip the balance for England in a war next session, or are we still 2 sessions away from seeing this colonial nation really start to have an impact?
I mean, it's hard to tell, but at the very least, they've got 200,000 troops, right? I mean, that's going to make a huge difference in any war they actually manage to arrive at. So as long as they properly plan out a war with them and really try and use them well, it's going to make a huge impact on any war. Just because I mean that many extra troops is a big deal.
Interesting to see. He's got a number of manufactories, even though this is a manpower state. I wonder if he's going to be swapping these manufactories out in the near future here. Buildings.
I mean, you've seen a
Oh
few
wow,
players.
it's all manufacturers. No
And
manpower buildings.
if you want to, if you look at Ruthenia, you'll see a very similar story there, where even though they're number one in manpower, they have got a lot of untapped potential as far as the soldiers' households go. Because all of those are on like things such as livestock and grain, and it's going to be a huge swing as soon as Curb actually decides to build the manpower buildings there.
Yeah, the one challenge he has is that New Württemberg doesn't have Curb's eco not as strong as England's. So England is able to subsidize New Württemberg, who, in its own right, even without the subsidies, is still pulling in over 100 ducats. So
Yeah.
that'll be interesting. And then Better Mexico, yeah, unfortunately not really a factor yet. Similar to South Mexico, 500 dev, not bad, but yeah, still got quite a bit of time till we see the impact coming out of Mexico.
Mhm. And that colony definitely got started later than it should have. And I mean, the same could be said with the Caribbean. I mean, the fact that that hasn't been colonized yet, I think, is what makes a huge difference in the eco of Spain, Portugal, and England. Because if they had that before now, any of the three, I think we'd be seeing a lot more of a mismatch in the economies of the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc.
Yeah, we're starting to see a few of the islands have now been colonized and a colonial nation is forming, but yeah, like you said, uh, day late, dollar short. And we'll also touch base. Ivory Coast now a little bit of money starting to come through there. Um,
Mhm.
we'll see how much from Zanzibar can be pushed down into South Africa as we uh, see Kilwa consolidated by Europeans. And this brings us to our final region. Kilwa fought, I think they fought England, they fought Spain, they fought France, and they fought Portugal. Um, and they went down swinging. It was a pretty
Mhm.
impressive fight from a minor versus a number of great powers carving him up. As you can see, France, I took a chunk out of the Congo. England took a chunk out of Zanzibar and Zambezi, and Portugal ended up with an expansion in the Cape. Um, the Portuguese War in particular was pretty impressive. Kilwa managed to continue to fight the war in a guerrilla fashion through a bankruptcy. So they fought the
Mhm.
war for, I think, almost 20 years total, 5 of which they were bankrupt. They managed to put troops in Iberia, which got Spain involved to help Portugal out. But it goes to show you, if you underestimate a player and don't have your armies in position day one, which Portugal only had a
Mhm.
small army in position and their fleet was mothballed, um, Kilwa made them pay. And
And not to mention that Kilwa also got attacked by AI during those wars. I noticed
yes,
Azeron in particular attacked them as well. So I mean,
yep,
it's very commendable the fact that I mean Kilwa stuck it out and made every single person involved pay for trying to pick on the little guy. Um, it's certainly commendable.
it was it was fun to watch. I feel a little bit bad for the player, Duel. He's relatively new to the community, but I think he was a little frustrated at first, but took it in stride and is returning as Kemmer, so playing as a vassal for Aratos. So that should
Hmm.
be interesting to see, and hopefully he's able to extract a little revenge on Europeans at some point. Let's see the
Hmm.
devastation map. Oh yeah, there's still prosperity has not returned to Lisboa. Wow, it's a
Also, one thing, this is just a small thing, but if you look at prosperity for Hungary, notice how like doesn't look great. That's because of the knights. In the whole game, I haven't been able to stop the knights, and I just now managed to get them vassalized. And honestly, that's more satisfying than winning the wars against the Mamluks, helping you against Spain. That's the most satisfying thing I've done this entire game is vassalize the knights for myself.
yeah. The rating mechanic and the impact it has on prosperity. For those who don't know, when a state hits prosperity, the goods produce modifier is significant, 25%, and then the dev cost is also very nice. So it's a pretty big swing if your land is prosperous versus not, considering production or goods produced modifier impacts not only your production income but also your trade income if you do control a decent amount of the trade node. So it can be a difference maker in a war. So here we are, 1640. Europe is entirely prosperous. The Qing Japan area entirely prosperous. Um, the Middle East and India is a mess. Where's the next player war in your mind?
I think there's a lot of possibilities. I think, I mean, since we're seeing some nations still kind of transitioning, like Baja still got to eat Mawar, we've got to see Kilwa disappear. We're going to see a lot of nations that you would expect to like look for a player war be a bit more distracted than they naturally would be at this stage. And I think it comes down to Bavaria. I think regardless of the circumstances on whose side, I think Bavaria is going to be where the next huge player war starts because that's really the only thing that's majorly contested at this point as far as players really wanting each other's lands. It's Hanover and Bavaria.
So you're putting your money on those two.
I think it's probably going to be a duke out between the two of them and a proxy war for every single nation bordering them. So,
I gotta think England is itching for another
mm,
player war at some point soon here. Um, we fought a couple, France versus England. Ruthenia got involved, Hungary got involved, Hanover was involved. But
Mhm.
since then, that 2 sessions in a row of silence for England. Um, they don't have
And
a
if
whole
so,
lot left to dev. Oh,
we get to see part 3 of the France Hanover Wars. I think if that happens, because I think if they go for a player, it's going to be just trying to consolidate more of that trade in Hanover, or taking it out on you as kind of revenge for the past 2 wars. So
yeah, it's possible. I just, knowing Panda, he's not the most aggressive, but he's not afraid to shake things up. Obviously, he took down Sweden in a move that surprised a few of us. Um, it was a bold move. It worked out well for him, and he's been relatively quiet. Expanding into Africa is fine. You can only stretch yourself so thin with overseas expansion. He does not have naval ideas, so he outside the wooden wall, he's not entirely dominant. He still has Irish ideas, so he doesn't even have um, England or Great Britain's naval ideas. A strong player in Japan, Qing, and a player taking over Baja permanently. I just don't see him continuing to expand in this direction. I think England's due for a Europe war. I think France is due for one.
I think part of the reason why you're seeing that freeze is if you just look at the trade map mode or going into the channel, it just tells the story. I mean, because you have 150 ducats going to that channel there, and I think that's probably what's slowing Panda down, because I think Panda knows that's a huge income loss as soon as you start fighting in Europe again.
Yeah, we do actually have a trade deal in place. I'm
Hmm.
the only one with trade ideas, so I'm subbing out, but I'm sending 300 plus ducats over to the English and a bit to Hanover. Um, yeah, it's a pretty rich trade node right now. But yeah, I think something's got to give. I don't have a lot going on outside Africa. England doesn't have a whole lot. Spain, I think, a little slow to develop, to be honest. I think they've got some internal growth left. Quite a few
Hmm.
buildings left to be built for them.
I think they've
Whereas,
definitely focused on Africa probably a bit in moments when they probably shouldn't have, as far as expansion goes.
yeah, they still have quite a
Especially
bit
without
of
deving
deving.
it,
Yeah.
which the same can be said for me. So there's some notable red spots there.
Have you finally? Okay, you have. Oh my god, Martian. Why is this not a level 3?
If you notice, there are some level 3s
But
where I'm planning on deving, but
this
yeah,
is the
no,
best one.
I've checked, and while there is a manpower difference, it's not a huge manpower difference, and until I'm done with my buildings, it's not worth paying for. So
It's a
it's right.
33% boost
I know it is.
to each province.
But whenever you're talking about up till now, I've had plenty of times where I could build a building for 300 ducats and get 2 to 3,000 manpower. At which point, it's better to build the manufactory. Now, I should have done it before I dev'd it. I will wholeheartedly admit. But
Yeah, because it gives you the dev
um,
cost reduction for the entire province or the entire state.
yeah, I think that's one of the ways where you see the big difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe right now is that the eco just isn't there as much for Eastern Europe. It's a lot poorer, even though we have good manpower. It's just not as much money to be had.
Yeah, we've got 500 here. This is 8, but you have to take away the diplomatic, so 4, 4. So between these three, you're pushing 1,300, and you do Tuscany 250, Hungary 220, Ruthenia. Yeah, you've got about 1,300 versus 800 if you group these three versus these three. That Yeah, that's a decent amount. It may make a difference when it comes
Yeah.
to some player wars in the future.
And not to mention that because of how I've played Diplo, there's not really a way where you see me, Tuscany, and Ruthenia on the same side in a war, unless Bavaria attacks me, um, which I would say is pretty unlikely. But it's just interesting because of the player alliances. You've seen Bavaria kind of just left out, but also it makes it to where the Eastern bloc per se isn't really a block. It's you get two people at most in any way you attack into it. So
Yeah, it's Tuscany and Hungary, and then Hungary and Ruthenia. There's, yeah, definitely no love between Tuscany and Ruthenia from what I've heard. So an attack on Ruthenia does not necessarily mean Tuscany's getting involved, and vice versa. Should be an interesting session though. Any final thoughts?
oh, nothing much really. Just once again, awesome job to Kilwa. That's I mean, wonderful job, and me and Jamie both kind of embarrassed ourselves this week. So it'll be interesting to see how it goes.
Yeah, as someone who fought AI Mamelukes late game last time, it is more difficult than expected when taking on an AI that's been played by a player for a long time period. And I'm excited for this week. I think something's going to happen here with Asia. I think they've been
I,
sitting around all game
mhm.
just building up, and they're willing to take a risk.
I could definitely see it, but also, I mean, I think rarely he'll probably want to go in when he knows he can win it. So I could see some planning between him and like England or him and Hanover to try and coordinate wars at the same time, um, which would definitely be interesting to see.
Yep. Well, until Saturday.
Until then.